All right, so we're up in the spare room at Wellspring, going through Able Project. We're on B, being a blessing. Specifically, what does it look like to be a faithful presence?
Yeah.
To practice that.
For sure, yeah.
Maybe start with sort of the overall arc of the scriptures
Yeah.
and how this sort of fits.
Sure, yeah. I think especially for this one, it really helps to see kind of the narrative arc of God's faithful presence to us,
Yeah.
and then how humans are to respond to that presence in light of that. So I think just right off the bat, Genesis 1 and 2, always kind of grounding it there as far as creation,
Sure.
7-day creation cycle in chapter 1 of
Okay.
Genesis. Again, that alludes to like temple, tabernacle imagery, because that.
So in the
kind of
ancient Near East, like they would have picked up, oh, this is temple,
Exactly.
tabernacle imagery.
Yeah, which the implication of that is that God is dwelling in the tabernacle, in the temple, and likewise God is dwelling in creation, all of creation. So his presence is being permeated throughout the entire cosmos at this point. And so that's a key motif really in Genesis 1.
And then carries over.
It carries over
into
the garden, right? So the Garden of Eden, you have humans. Well, Genesis 1, they're created in God's image.
Yeah.
And
Which
they're
is
called
big.
to,
Maybe we should go back to that.
Yeah, well, it's important because they're called to then represent God's faithful presence in the whole world.
So to be an image bearer is to represent the presence of whose image you bear.
Exactly,
So like in the ancient Near East, if you were made in the image of a king, you were representing the king with what he was doing.
Exactly, and the idea being like the ancient king might not physically be in, like, say, that province, 100 miles away, but he might have his image, or kind of the same word as idol, to be representative of the presence of the king in that spot. And so humans function in this representative way, and in particular, representing God's presence. Now, in the garden, Genesis 2, humans are called to work and to keep, and that's the same pairing of words, Genesis 2:15, that later gets used in the narratives of the tabernacle and later the temple.
So the priests work and keep the temple.
Exactly, yeah. So it's worship language, it's faithful presence language, it's vocation language.
And God's walking with them in Eden.
Exactly, in the Garden of Eden. And so kind of the picture we get when looking at Genesis 1 and 2 is that you have humans created in God's image, called to represent God in creation, and they're to represent God in such a way where they're depicted as living in this garden in Eden, and they're kind of commissioned to kind of expand and really carry out God's presence to the broader world, that there's more work to be done in this representative type role. Now, the tragedy...
we have a fall.
We have a fall, Genesis 3. The tragedy here happens where, they choose their own way, they don't trust what God has told them, and so there's this kind of exile, if you will, where they're exiled or banished from the garden to the east. And so then this becomes kind of the tension or the plot line of the story, where there's this rift between what God intends as far as his presence with his people and how humans experience and respond to that presence.
And how they bear that image.
Exactly, yeah.
Or they are that faithful presence.
Yeah, so now we're all made in the image of God, but that image, people talk about being like a cracked mirror or sort of broken to a certain degree. And so we're not perfectly, in the way that God intended, reflecting that image out into the broader world. You see that as the narrative continues. Sin kind of propels and so on and so forth. But then what you have, as the story picks up, is that God calls Abraham, and through Abraham and his family, they're going to be a blessing to the nations. And God is going to promise to be with this family, Abraham and his family, as that mission
promise of
continues.
presence.
Exactly, yes. And so really the promise of God's presence is one of these key sort of major themes that really unites and ties the rest of the storyline of the Bible together. So when Israel ends up in slavery in Egypt, and they're under oppression under the Pharaoh, God hears and responds to the cry of his people and comes down.
So he's present with them.
Present with them to the point where when Moses and God are kind of going back and forth at the burning bush, there's this really fun scene where Moses is like, well, who do I tell the people sent me? And like, what's your name? Who are you? And God doesn't really answer the question. He just responds with, I will be with you. That's all Moses needs to know at this point. God's presence is going to
Moses
be
wants
with
information, and God's like, no, I'll be there with you.
Yes, and so Moses is reminded and called to anchor himself in the presence of God. Later on, when they get delivered from Egypt, cross the Red Sea, they come to the foot of Mount Sinai. There's this huge debacle with the golden calf.
Yeah, they mess up pretty bad.
God's super ticked at this point, and there's this kind of comical slash funny slash kind of what in the world's going on kind of story, where God says something to the effect of, God or Moses, I'm just going to restart this whole thing. These are like a stiff-necked people. I want nothing to do with them. And Moses responds and says, God, if you're not going to be with us, if you're not going to stick with us, how will the rest of the nations know that we belong to you. And Moses says, is it not with your going with us, with your presence, that we are distinct?
Yeah. So the distinction of the people of God is actually connected to the presence of God.
I mean, think about that with Israel. There's a bunch of things that make Israel distinct. Food laws, all these different moral obligations they have to do, the tabernacle, worship, all that sort of stuff. But it comes down to God's presence. That's what makes them distinct. Now, the story keeps going on. Tabernacle, temple, again, these are all themes of God's presence dwelling with his people. And here's where we begin to see even more so when you get into the Psalms and some of that literature. Yeah. God's people responding to his presence, this desire to want to be in the temple. Psalm 27:4 says, one thing I've asked of the Lord, one thing I will seek after, is that I may dwell in the house of the Lord and gaze upon his beauty.
So there's this desire of the psalmist and God's people to just be with God in his presence.
Exactly. And it's from that place then that they continue on that mission to bless and to represent God in the world. Now, again, the tragedy continues in this story where Israel goes into rebellion, chooses their own way, really goes after all these other gods, and kind of disassociates themselves with the presence of God, who is all wanting to be with them and pursue them. And there's this really tragic story in Ezekiel 10 where Ezekiel has this vision of God's presence leaving the tabernacle or leaving the temple. And it's this picture where Israel's being hauled off in exile. And as a result, God is really no longer with them in the same sense as he was previously. And it's really this sad tragedy moment of the story. And so what then happens then is the prophets anticipate and look forward to the day when God would return, when Yahweh would return and dwell with his people again in Zion, in Jerusalem.
And then we get Emmanuel.
Emmanuel, right?
And so God with us.
With us. And that's Jesus, Matthew chapter 1, John chapter 1, there's the language of Jesus. He tabernacled among us. Eugene Peterson translates that, moved into the neighborhood. And so you have in the person of Jesus himself, God with his people, the presence of God fully and finally kind of realized in the human, in the person of Jesus, to the point when post-crucifixion, post-resurrection, as he ascends or is about to ascend back to the Father, he has that beautiful famous line of, I will be with you always.
Yeah, Matthew 28. I love that because the context of it is, right, there were people that were worshiping and doubting. So you have these doubting worshipers that are with Jesus, and he says to them, I have it written here, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, and behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. And then you get into Acts 1:8, and you have this idea of that the Spirit's going to come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. This sort of progressive sense of the people of God, just like in Genesis 1, we're meant to carry the presence of God, bear his image throughout the world. That's happening through the church, through the presence of the Spirit, with God's people, and now they're meant to carry this faithful presence wherever they go.
For sure, and that's why I love, talking about the gift of the Spirit. Gordon Fee calls the Holy Spirit God's empowering presence, right? And so being a recipient of the Holy Spirit as followers of Jesus, we're now commissioned and called, just like Genesis 1 and 2, image of God, to represent God's faithful presence to the rest of the world. And so we kind of end the biblical story, though, with this full and final realization of the dwelling place of God, Revelation 22, is with man, where that faithful presence is fully and finally realized and experienced.
It says that, right?
In the new creation.
Yeah, he is with us. He will be with us when he makes all things new. He will dwell with us.
Exactly. And so the call for us as followers of Jesus today is, how might we be a faithful presence in our cultural moment? To the God who already is, number one, faithfully present to us, but then to extend that presence and to extend that representation out into the broader world.
I think one of the trickinesses for me personally, I remember when we came down to do this church plant at Wellspring, it was this sense of like, how am I supposed to represent God? Right? Like, who am I? I'm a broken guy trying to do the best I can. And it was this interesting moment where God, I think, said something to me like, Tony, like, I'm not like mistaken about you. I know your brokenness. I know your strengths. I know your weakness. And I'm sending you. And it was this moment where I realized, oh, I can just be me, how God made me, with my strengths and my weaknesses, and allow that to inform the way I'm present.
For sure.
on behalf of his kingdom.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting just even hearing you say that as far as just responding to God's call, thinking like Abraham in Genesis 12.
Yeah.
And then recognizing that God is going to be with you and that God didn't make a mistake with Abraham or any of these biblical characters, and God hasn't made a mistake with you.
Yeah.
And to recognize that as we are attentive to God's presence in our lives, we're called to then be present and witness to the presence of God to those around us.
Yeah. I was reading this morning about Joshua 2, and Joshua, sends the 2 spies out into Jericho, and Rahab is there, and God has been at work in Rahab before the spies even entered Jericho.
For sure.
And it's this moment of realizing today, as I was thinking about, just like, man, God is at work in all these people, inside and outside the church. And the question is, are we attuned to that?
For sure.
Are we paying attention to the way that God is already at work, already present, and are we attuning ourselves to his presence and then bringing and bearing that presence wherever we go?
Totally, yeah. And that gets at this idea of kind of even going back to Genesis 1 and 2, God being present throughout all creation. God is already working. Jesus even says something to that effect in the Gospel of John. I'm doing what the Father is already doing. And then for us to be a witness to that. And I think sometimes when we're talking about like, witnessing to Jesus and talking about like what God is doing.
I feel like you need like a PhD or
to
something
be
in
an
apologetics.
Totally, right? And I think we've talked about this before of the call to not be necessarily experts. Knowledge isn't bad, but to be witnesses. Witnesses to God's presence in my own life, witnesses to what God has already done or is doing in my life, and to be, we've used this phrase before, like a billboard to the goodness
living
of God.
billboard. It's called Karl Barth.
Yeah, totally.
But it's this feeling of, what does a witness do? A witness tells a story.
Yeah.
Witness shares a perspective.
For sure.
So we are called, right, as image bearers to tell the story of God.
Yeah. To tell the story of God's faithful presence
to us
and extending that out into the world.
Totally.
So.
Yeah. Anything you'd suggest for people as they're sort of wrestling with this?
Yeah, I think for me, and I think hopefully for a lot of us, is that especially in our fast-paced culture, it really is important to slow down our lives so that we become the kinds of people, and this bleeds into a little bit with like attending to the presence of God in our lives, slowing down, paying attention, seeing where is God already at work, like you were just saying in Joshua 2. Where is God already at work in the relationships, in the people, in the circumstances that I'm already in, and then responding to that. I think that's this kind of the second part with that. Asking, Spirit of God, where are you leading me? What do you have for me to say or to pray or to do in that moment that would faithfully represent you?
Yeah, that the goal is for us to align with God's mission in the world,
totally.
not to sort of campaign or start our own.
For sure, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, man.